The history of money is also the history of power. For centuries, empires were built on armies, territories, and flags. But the 20th century brought a quieter and more sophisticated form of rule, the rule of currency. The dollar, born as a symbol of prosperity and freedom, slowly became the key to an invisible cage that few recognize, but from which almost no one escapes. That cage isn't made of bars or walls, but of debt, of imposed trust, of promises sustained by paper and power. And the most disturbing thing is that most prisoners unknowingly defend it, believing that what is freedom is actually dependence. Thus was born the dollar prison, a system that requires no violence to subdue, only faith. Money was once a medium, a bridge between effort and reward. But over time, that bridge became destiny itself. We no longer work to live, but to sustain the flow of a current that no one fully controls. The dollar, in its rise, became a global religion. Their temples are banks, their prophets are economists, their scriptures are balance sheets, and their rituals are markets. Every transaction, every payment, every debt strengthens the walls of that prison that appears to be a paradise of consumption and security. But every faith has its origin. The dollar didn't rise by chance, but by design. It was forged in a context of war, reconstruction, opportunity, and ambition. The United States understood something that the old empires barely grasped. Those who control money don't need to conquer territory. He just needs others to believe there's no alternative. And so, as the 20th century progressed, the entire world began to pay tribute not to an emperor, but to a coin. The irony is that the dollar was born under a flag that proclaimed freedom. But its global expansion created a web of dependency that today imprisons even those who defend it most. Countries hoard dollars to protect themselves, but in doing so, they reinforce the power of their own jailer. Businesses, banks, governments, and even ordinary citizens bow before the stability of the dollar, failing to realize that this stability depends on the imbalance of all the others. Every greenback is a promise of control disguised as security. From its inception, the dollar was a geopolitical project, not just an economic one. The creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 was not an administrative act, but the installation of the heart of a machine that would transform the world. A machine that breathes debt and expels power, that instills trust and buys obedience. Its design allowed a small group of private institutions to control something everyone needed. And so, without firing a single shot, a global conquest sustained by contracts, reserves, and fear began. A conquest that no one saw coming because it was legal, clean, and elegant. Throughout the 20th century, the dollar became the pulse of the planet. When it rises, the world breathes. When it falls, the world trembles. Its fluctuations determine the price of bread, the value of oil, the cost of housing, and the fate of entire economies. But behind this apparent economic rationality lies a system of domination more subtle than any army. One who doesn't conquer lands, but consciences. And every time a country tries to free itself from it, the response is quick to come. Sanctions, blockades, or crises. The power of the dollar is measured not only in wealth, but in obedience. The United States discovered it could punish without invading, destroy economies without shooting, subjugate without getting its hands dirty. Financial sanctions became the new weapons of war. The SWIFT system, global banks, international organizations, all function as walls in this invisible prison. And the most disturbing thing is that the entire world is collaborating to keep them standing. Because no one wants to imagine what would happen if that faith collapsed. But every prison has cracks. And all faith at some point is put to the test. Financial crises, bank bailouts, runaway inflation, and currency wars have begun to erode the blind faith in the greenback. China, Russia, the BRICS countries, and even digital ecosystems have begun to develop alternatives. History seems to repeat itself. Every monetary empire eventually believes its power is eternal, just before it falls. And perhaps the dollar is entering that stage of fragility disguised as strength. The listener at this point should not look for certainties. Because this isn't a story of conspiracies, but of cycles. Cycles that begin with the promise of freedom and end with the illusion of control. The dollar, like the pound, gold, and silver before it, is just one chapter in a larger story, that of the human desire to dominate and be dominated. And as long as that desire exists, there will be new prisons to call freedom. That's the real paradox of money. The power that promises us independence is the same one that binds us. So, as we delve into this story, remember one essential thing. The dollar represents not just a currency, but a mindset. A form of collective faith that sustains the modern world. Understanding its origin, its mechanisms, and its scope is not only a historical exercise, but an act of liberation. Because whoever understands how their prison works has already taken the first step toward breaking out. And on this journey, rather than looking for culprits, we will seek to understand the true price of trust. Chapter 1, 1913, The Federal Reserve and the Beginning of Control. At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States was experiencing an unprecedented industrial boom. Factories roared like new cathedrals of progress, and cities grew, driven by faith in the machine and capital. But beneath that luminous surface, the American financial system was a nervous organism, prone to collapse. The banking panics of 1893 and 1907 had left deep scars, destroyed fortunes, closed banks, ruined families. It was then that the great financiers understood something essential. Chaos was the perfect excuse to impose the order that they themselves would control. And thus the idea of a central bank was born. Not for the people, but about the people. In 1910, a group of the most powerful men on the planet traveled secretly to a small island in Georgia. Jekyll Island. There, hidden from public scrutiny, they spent days and nights designing what would later become known as the Federal Reserve Act. The names that would dominate the century were represented: Morgan, Rockefeller, Warburg. They were not politicians, but architects of financial power. Their goal was not to stabilize the banking system, but to centralize it under a structure that, although called federal, did not really answer to the state. That secret meeting was the true birth of modern money, a money based on trust and debt. When Woodrow Wilson signed the law in 1913, it was presented as a patriotic act. There was talk of security, stability, and prosperity. But behind the speeches lay something deeper, the handing over of the country's economic soul to a private entity disguised as a public institution. From that moment on, the state became a permanent debtor of the Federal Reserve. Each dollar issued would be a promissory note, a debt with interest, a promise that would chain the future. National independence, which had been the pride of the American Revolution, began to be measured in treasury bonds and interest rates. The system that was born then had an almost theological logic. Money no longer represented gold or labor, but faith. Faith that the banks would pay. Faith that the government would sustain the economy. Faith that the future would always be more prosperous than the present. But that faith had to be managed. Thus, the Federal Reserve became a sort of modern-day priest, regulating the cycles of hope and despair, turning the credit spigot on and off to keep the illusion of control alive. It was the birth of a religion without gods, where the altar was a desk, and the host, a greenback. The Federal Reserve's power lay in something almost magical. It could create money out of thin air. Using the fractional reserve system, banks could lend far more than they actually had. Thus, the economy inflated like a hot air balloon held aloft by promises. And with each expansion of credit, society became a little more tied to debt. Citizens believed they owned houses, land, and businesses, but in reality, they were held hostage by mortgages, loans, and signed bills. A new form of slavery had been invented: voluntary credit slavery. World War I was the first major experiment in this system. Financed largely by debt, it demonstrated the almost unlimited power of the money machine. The Federal Reserve could expand the money base to pay for the war without any gold, and the banks made huge profits by financing both sides. It was the first time in history that a nation was able to sustain a global conflict thanks to the massive creation of money. And in the end, when the guns fell silent, the debts still lived on. The nations had been defeated not only by weapons, but by accrued interest. The listener at this point should not look for certainties, for this is not a tale of conspiracies, but of cycles. Cycles that begin with the promise of freedom and end with the illusion of control. The dollar, like the pound, gold, or silver before it, is but one chapter in a larger story, that of the human desire to dominate and be dominated. And as long as that desire exists, there will be new prisons to call freedom. That is the true paradox of money. The power that promises us independence is the same one that binds us. After 1913, the modern citizen ceased to be the owner of his labor and became the manager of his debt. Everything he bought, everything he dreamed of, was measured in terms of credit. Physical money became less important than digital debt, the invisible numbers that grew or disappeared in a closed system. And meanwhile, political power became increasingly subordinated to financial cycles. Government decisions were no longer made at the ballot box, but at the board meetings of the Federal Reserve. Democracy, little by little, began to be listed on the stock market. The 20th century would witness how this system was perfected. Wars, crises, bailouts. Each event reinforced the role of the Federal Reserve as the arbiter of the world's economic destiny. But the price was high. Citizens lost control of their currency, their time, and their future. Money, once a medium of exchange, became an instrument of domination. What began as a technical project ended up being an invisible prison, maintained by collective faith. A prison without bars, without walls, without sentinels. And so, from 1913 on, the world entered a new era, the era of absolute financial control. Countries were no longer sovereign, but debtors. People no longer worked for freedom, but for credit. Wealth was transformed into perpetual debt, and faith in the dollar became the most powerful religion on earth. There was no more efficient military conquest, no more universal creed. Since then, the entire world breathes to the rhythm of an institution that no one elected and that everyone obeys. That was the true revolution of 1913, the birth of money as a prison. Chapter 2, 1944, Bretton Woods and the New Order. The year was 1944. The entire world was exhausted, bleeding, and about to reconfigure itself. In the midst of World War II, as Europe burned and Asia collapsed, in a small town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, 44 nations gathered to decide the economic fate of the planet. Officially, it was a monetary conference to rebuild global stability. In practice, it was the moment when the United States, owner of 2/3 of the world's gold and the greatest industrial power, imposed its vision of order. And with that, a new form of empire was born. An empire without armies, built with banknotes, taxes, and reserves. In the quiet hills above the Mount Washington Hotel, delegates debated concepts like balance of payments, trade, and monetary stability. But behind the technical formulas and speeches, something deeper was at stake, the very definition of economic freedom. The British architect, John Maynard Keynes, dreamed of a balanced system with a neutral international currency called the Bancor. But the Americans, led by Harry Dexter White, had another plan: to place the dollar at the center of global architecture. Under his proposal, all currencies would be tied to the dollar, and the dollar, in turn, to gold. This ensured that global faith depended on a single nation. The agreement was presented as a stability pact. Each country would set the value of its currency against the dollar, and the United States would guarantee the convertibility of each banknote into gold at the rate of $35 per ounce. At first glance, it was a balanced compromise, trust in exchange for monetary discipline. But deep down, it meant something else. Gold would no longer be the center of the system, but the dollar. Whoever controlled the dollar controlled the world. Thus, in a room surrounded by flags and microphones, the United States sealed its hegemony with invisible ink, that of global credit. After the war, the ruins of Europe became fertile ground for the new order. Countries needed dollars to rebuild, buy machinery, import food. And dollars flowed from Washington like golden rivers. The Marshall Plan was as much an economic aid as a political investment. Every loan, every credit was a soft chain tying foreign economies to the dollar system. Soon, the greenback replaced gold as a measure of value and as a symbol of power. The world's faith was no longer in vaults, but in the American promise of infinite abundance. Bretton Woods also saw the birth of institutions that endure to this day: the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. Presented as guardians of stability, they soon became the financial arms of the new empire. Countries in crisis turned to them for help, but that help always came with conditions: reforms, adjustments, privatizations. Thus, the dollar not only dominated the markets, but also the internal politics of nations. Debt was transformed into a diplomatic tool, and the economy into an instrument of geopolitical power. It was no longer necessary to invade a country to control it. During the 1950s and 1960s, the system seemed to work perfectly. The global economy was growing, trade was expanding, and countries trusted in the strength of the dollar. But beneath that surface of prosperity lurked a dangerous contradiction. The United States printed more dollars than it could back with gold. Each war, each social program, each credit expansion slowly eroded the promise of convertibility. The gold remained still in Fort Knox, but the banknotes circulated around the world like multiplied ghosts. Faith was beginning to overcome reality. In this context, Charles de Gaulle, President of France, dared to challenge the system. In 1965, he ordered the French dollar reserves to be converted into gold, demanding physical delivery of the metal. It was a symbolic act, but a revealing one. Many were beginning to suspect that the gold behind the dollar was more promise than substance. Tensions grew, and the system's balance began to crack. As more countries demanded their gold, America's vaults emptied. The monetary empire was beginning to feel the weight of its own excess. Yet in 1944, no one could have foreseen this fall. At Bretton Woods, the dream was still pure, clothed in noble words: cooperation, stability, growth. But the design bore within it the seeds of imbalance, a global system dependent on a single currency, and therefore, a single will. The United States exported not only products, but also its model, its debt, its politics. The dollar became an extension of its flag. And the rest of the world, voluntarily or forcibly, knelt before this new altar. The listener at this point should imagine the map of the world as a golden spiderweb. In the center, the dollar. At the edges, the dependent economies that revolve around it. Every movement in Washington translates into turbulence in Tokyo, London, and Buenos Aires. The promise of global stability became a mechanism of permanent surveillance. The entire world was incorporated into the cycle of credit and debt, into the constant flow of money created by decree. And although nations believed they had sovereignty, their economies breathed to the rhythm of the dollar. This was how the Bretton Woods Agreement, signed in wartime with the hope of peace, built a new kind of empire. One that didn't need tanks or colonies because its weapons were invisible: credit, interest, reserves. The dollar became the lifeblood of the system, and the Federal Reserve, its hidden heart. Every nation, large and small, depended on that pulse. And so what was called the International Monetary Order was, in reality, a carefully designed global prison. A gilded prison where power was measured in trust, and trust in obedience. The year is 1944. The world still smells of gunpowder, smoke, and ash. The powers, exhausted by the effort of war, seek not only peace, but structure. In a small town in New Hampshire, representatives from 44 nations are meeting with a seemingly noble purpose: to rebuild the financial world on a solid foundation. There, in the halls of the Mount Washington Hotel, something more than a financial agreement is born. An invisible architecture of power is born. The dollar, backed by gold, becomes the new axis of global trade. And under the promise of stability, global dependence on a single currency is sealed. No one in that room could have imagined they were building a new prison with walls made of paper and trust. The words flow with diplomatic elegance: cooperation, prosperity, reconstruction. But behind the speeches, the game was already decided. The United States possessed 2/3 of the world's gold and an intact industrial base. Europe was in ruins. Asia was devastated. No one could question the winner. Thus, while the British economist John Maynard Keynes proposed a global currency called bank, American Harry Dexter White imposed another vision: a system where all currencies would be linked to the dollar and the dollar to gold. Hegemony masquerades as stability. The world accepts. And the cage slowly begins to close. Bretton Woods was not just a technical agreement. It was an act of geopolitical engineering. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are born as guardians of the new order. Its mission: to lend money to nations in need, maintain stability, and prevent crises. But each loan came with conditions, reforms, adjustments, and sacrifices. Control was no longer exercised through armies, but through interest rates. Debt becomes the new form of submission. And the dollar, ostensibly backed by gold, becomes the silent judge of everyone's prosperity. A new empire had been born, without the need for territories. All it took was faith. For the next few years, the system worked. European economies revived with the Marshall Plan, financed by the same dollars the system forced them to use. Each country accumulated greenbacks in its reserves, believing they could redeem them for gold whenever they wanted. But gold doesn't grow at the pace of human ambition. The more dollars circulated, the less real the backing became. The balance was sustained only by a collective illusion: trust. The world was prospering, yes, but on an increasingly fragile foundation. The promise of stability was, at its core, a pact with risk. And the risk, as always, would present itself disguised as opportunity. The 1950s and 1960s were the golden age of the dollar. International trade flourished. American factories produced, banks expanded, and developing countries dreamed of modernity. The dollar was not just a currency, it was an economic religion. To believe in it was to believe in the future, in progress, in the American dream extended to the world. But every system based on faith has an invisible limit: the moment when reality begins to outweigh belief. As the US spent on wars, social programs, and expansion, its gold reserves began to run out. The mirage of abundance was about to crack. And when faith falters, the entire system trembles. France was the first to doubt. Charles de Gaulle, with his nationalist vision, demanded that French dollars be converted into physical gold. Entire ships crossed the Atlantic carrying bullion back to Europe. It was a symbolic gesture, but devastating. If other countries followed suit, America's reserves would evaporate. There was no longer enough gold to go around. The prison of trust was cracking. And in the halls of Washington, economists understood that the system that ruled the world was built on air. An air that would soon dissipate. Bretton Woods was, in appearance, an alliance for peace. In practice, it was the birth of a network of economic control so subtle that few understood it. The central banks of each nation were trapped in a relationship of dependence. Deficits were financed with debt, and the debt was paid with dollars. The flow seemed eternal. But like any river that grows out of control, sooner or later it finds its limit. That limit would be called 1971. The moment when gold would cease to be the mirror of the dollar, and paper would reclaim its independence, or its condemnation. From then on, the system would be pure credit. And faith, the only guarantee. Bretton Woods did not die that day, in August 1971. It only changed form. The dollar, freed from gold, became something even more powerful. A currency without limits, capable of expanding like human ambition itself. The world accepted this new faith without question, because the alternatives were too chaotic. Thus, the system that had been born as a promise of order was transformed into an engine of inequality. Every country that accepted loans also accepted a part of the chain. Every citizen, by using dollars, unknowingly reinforced the invisible bars of the financial prison. And as the flow of money grew, power concentrated. A power that no longer depended on gold, but on blind faith in a greenback. A faith that, to this day, sustains the world. The listener, at this point, should stop. Close their eyes. Listen to the echo of a decision made more than 80 years ago, in a mountain hotel. Because what was signed, there was no simple treaty. It was the contract that defined the modern era of money. A contract that still governs every purchase, every debt, every economic war. Bretton Woods is not ancient history. It is the present disguised as the past. A reminder that every system based on faith is doomed to prove its own truth when faith runs out. And that moment, perhaps, has already begun. Chapter 3, 1971. Nixon breaks the chains of gold. The year is 1971. The world is watching as the United States, the nation that promised eternal stability, staggers under the weight of its own power. Gold reserves are slowly being depleted, drained by wars, deficits, and overconfidence. The dollar, once backed by a tangible promise, is beginning to look more like faith than security. European banks are demanding that their paper reserves be exchanged for real gold. Ships are once again setting sail from New York, laden with ingots, like a silent exodus of the metal that had sustained the illusion. And in Washington, alarm bells are ringing. The U.S. Treasury is emptying. Something must be done. And so, on one televised night, President Richard Nixon delivers a speech that would change the world. Gold will no longer back the dollar. With those words, spoken on August 15, 1971, financial history entered a new era. For the first time, money is completely disconnected from anything physical. The gold standard, a symbol of discipline and limits, is being shattered in the name of flexibility and modernization. On the surface, it was a temporary measure. Nixon called it a temporary adjustment. But the transience became permanent. Money from then on would no longer represent a quantity of gold, but rather the promise of a government. The dollar becomes an idea so powerful that it manages to replace the metal that previously held it. Faith, once again, becomes the world's new currency. The impact was immediate and profound. The markets reacted with bewilderment. Foreign currencies began to fluctuate without the anchor of gold. Inflation soared, prices became unstable, and the global economy felt the vertigo of a leap without a safety net. But in the chaos, opportunity was also born. Money was now limitless. Central banks could create credit without relying on metallic reserves. Debt, previously restricted by the weight of gold, became an instrument of expansion. Capitalism entered its most symbolic, most abstract, and most dependent phase on human desire. And the world learned that trust could replace any metal. What had been an economy based on scarcity became one based on infinite promise. The Federal Reserve, freed from the straitjacket of gold, could print money to sustain consumption, finance wars, and keep the system breathing. The concept of sovereign debt became acceptable, even necessary. The monetary machine was transformed into an engine without brakes. Each crisis could be solved with more liquidity, each recession with more credit. The dollar, unchained, spread across the planet like a religion without heretics. But absolute freedom also brought invisible consequences. By breaking the chains of gold, Nixon freed money, but also illusion. And that illusion, multiplied by decades, would shape future bubbles. Bubbles made of hope, debt, and desire. The 1970s were an economic laboratory. Oil became the new gold, and the dollar its sacred intermediary. The United States quietly negotiated with Saudi Arabia. Crude oil would only be sold in dollars. Thus was born the petrodollar, an agreement that extended the hegemony of the American currency beyond gold, beyond trade, beyond meaning. To buy energy, nations had to accumulate dollars. And to obtain them, they had to go into debt, trade, or submit to the rules of the global financial system. The greenback, now without physical backing, found a new kind of gold: control. Control of the flow of energy, of debt, of trade. The entire world breathed to the rhythm of the dollar. And few dared to question who was holding the machine. But something deeper was happening. The change was not only economic, but philosophical. Gold had represented a limit, a way to remember that wealth must have a real basis. Fiat money, on the other hand, erased that limit. There was no longer a border between value and illusion. Price became opinion, and the economy was transformed into a shared narrative, a story told by governments, banks, and markets. A story where faith, not metal, determines the stability of peoples. What once shone with weight, now shone with consensus. And that consensus, as fragile as the human mind, became the new standard of the world. The fiat dollar brought with it a paradox. On the one hand, it offered flexibility, growth, and maneuvering power. On the other, it sowed the seeds of inflation, inequality, and rampant speculation. Financial bubbles became a natural part of the system, and the banks learned that risk could be transferred, dissolved, spread out, but never disappeared. Unlimited money transformed the work ethic into the credit ethic. Wealth stopped being created and began to multiply by desire. And in that multiplication, the world forgot the difference between value and price, between having and owing, between wealth and eternal debt. For many, 1971 was the year of the liberation of money. For others, it was the beginning of its most subtle imprisonment. Because without gold to limit it, the dollar became a mirage without a horizon. An infinite promise that, as it expands, also corrupts. Nations began to measure their power not in gold, but in debt. Citizens, their success not in production, but in consumption. And the global economy was transformed into a perpetual cycle of credit, interest, and bailouts. A cycle where trust, not gold, keeps the building standing. A building without foundations, held up by faith, screens, and numbers. An invisible temple where everyone prays to the same symbol, the dollar. The listener, at this point, must imagine the silence that followed Nixon's announcement. A silence that was not only economic, but spiritual. Because the end of gold wasn't simply a political decision. It was a shift in awareness of value. Money stopped being a representation of effort and became a representation of desire. From that moment on, every printed bill is an act of faith. Every transaction, a prayer for stability. And every crisis, a reminder that even the strongest beliefs can fade. Gold fell, but the illusion remained. And so the dollar prison grew bigger, brighter, and more invisible. Chapter 4: The Petrodollar, Energy and Obedience. In the early 1970s, the world woke up to a new reality. Money was no longer tied to gold, but to oil. Nixon's decision had left a vacuum, a space that needed a new foundation of trust. And that base would be black, viscous, and fiery, crude oil. The United States realized that if it could no longer back its currency with metal, it would have to do so with necessity. Oil was that universal need, the lifeblood that kept industrial civilization moving. Thus was born one of the most influential and least understood pacts of the 20th century. A silent agreement, sealed between Washington and Riyadh, between military power and energy wealth. In exchange for protection, Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in dollars. And with that gesture, the greenback found a new altar. It was no longer gold that sustained him, but the planet's energy hunger. That pact, signed without fanfare, redrew the world economic map. Every country that needed oil had to first obtain dollars. Importing nations were forced to trade, go into debt, or surrender to the American financial system. The dollar became the ticket to the engine of modernity. Europe, Japan, and later China began accumulating reserves of American currency, not out of loyalty, but for survival. Money ceased to be a medium of exchange and became an instrument of obedience. And at the center of it all, oil, the new standard of value. While gold slept in vaults, crude oil burned in the world's engines. And with every barrel sold, the dollar grew a little stronger. It was a perfect system, invisible, efficient, and almost impossible to challenge. The 1970s saw this new order consolidated through carefully managed crises. In 1973, the Arab-dominated OPEC imposed an oil embargo in response to the Yom Kippur War. Prices soared. Western economies ground to a halt. And while the world suffered, the United States emerged more powerful than ever. Because even though oil was rising, it was still priced in dollars. Every barrel sold meant more demand for the US currency. The suffering of others fueled the strength of the financial empire. Energy dependence became monetary dependence. And so, without firing a single shot, Washington conquered the world once again. In this new scenario, the dollar became a geopolitical weapon. Every nation that dared to challenge the system suffered consequences. Iran, Iraq, Libya. All those who tried to sell their oil in another currency were isolated, sanctioned, or destroyed. The message was clear. There is no energy without the dollar. And without energy, there is no progress. The petrodollar became an energy prison that defined US foreign policy for decades. Behind speeches about democracy and freedom, an uncomfortable truth lurked. Controlling the flow of energy was equivalent to controlling the world. Tanks and aircraft carriers were merely custodians of that monetary faith. And the financial system, its most sacred temple. A modern religion sustained by debt, oil, and fear. Over time, the petrodollar became so natural that few dared to imagine an alternative. The world's central banks accumulated dollar reserves because not doing so meant being left out of the game. Stock markets, international transactions, loans, everything revolved around a single currency. It was like breathing invisible air. No one saw it, but everyone depended on it. And when anyone dared to question it, the global machinery responded with sanctions, blockades, or economic wars. Oil, the resource that promised prosperity, became a reminder of dependence. And the dollar, the symbol of that dependence, became a financial shackle. Economic freedom was transformed into obedience disguised as stability. And the world learned to call its own submission order. However, the power of the petrodollar was not only measured in reserves or transactions. It was also measured in the ability to shape behavior. Emerging economies adopted the rules of the IMF and the World Bank, institutions that, under the guise of aid, perpetuated dependency. Loans came with conditions, and conditions came with loss of sovereignty. Thus, each nation became hostage to a system that called prosperity debt. And while the elites accumulated wealth, the people bore the brunt. It was the same logic of the old gold standard, but in a new guise. Gold glittered in vaults, oil burned in refineries, and the dollar dominated them both. It was the economy of fire, heat that moves, burns, and consumes. A flame that illuminates the world, but also chains it. In the 1980s and 1990s, the system reached maturity. The dollar was the language of commerce, the symbol of success, and the measure of power. Transnational corporations grew like new empires without a flag, fueled by the system's infinite liquidity. Every transaction on Wall Street had an echo in the Arabian Desert, in the fields of Texas, or on the shores of the Persian Gulf. Money and energy had merged in a perfect dance. But beneath that perfection, something was beginning to crack. The rise of China, the creation of the euro, the tensions in the Middle East, all were symptoms of an artificial equilibrium. A system so vast it couldn't collapse, but it couldn't sustain itself forever either. And the price of this apparent stability was the loss of collective sovereignty. The world's freedom was bought with oil and sold in dollars. As the 21st century progressed, the first signs of wear and tear became visible. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, justified with moral rhetoric, had energy roots. The expansion of financial sanctions became the new form of warfare. Armies were no longer needed. Blocking transactions, freezing assets, or cutting off access to the SWIFT system was enough. Monetary control became a more precise tool than any missile. Nations understood that challenging the dollar was like challenging the air they breathe. But air can become thin. And when oxygen becomes scarce, attempts at rupture arise. China, Russia, and other powers began to look for alternative routes, new currencies, and bilateral agreements. The bipolar world of oil and the dollar was beginning to fragment. Today, the petrodollar is still alive, but its breath is shorter. The energy transition threatens to weaken its dominance. Cryptocurrencies, the digital yuan, and regional agreements point to a different horizon. But the lesson of this chapter lies not only in the system that was built, but in the logic that sustains it. Because power will always seek a new form of anchorage. If gold was the first shackle and oil the second, what will be the next? Perhaps data, digital energy, or human attention itself. Money changes form, but it never abandons its purpose, to dominate. And as long as the world believes that energy is outside of it, it will continue to obediently pay for what it could possess in freedom. This is how the petrodollar became more than just a system. It became a mirror of the human soul. Chapter 5: Financial Sanctions, the Invisible Punishment. The modern world no longer needs walls or chains to subdue a nation. Punishment today travels through fiber optic cables, runs through banking algorithms, and is felt in the silence of blocked accounts. Financial sanctions are the new face of power. They don't destroy cities, but they shut down entire economies. They don't shed blood, but they leave millions without access to medicine, food, or credit. Their effectiveness lies in their invisibility. They cannot be seen, heard, or smelled. But they're there, operating like a silent suffocation. A nation can continue to breathe, but each breath is shorter, more costly, more controlled. This is how the empire of money learned to punish without killing, to dominate without declaring oneself master. The international financial system, dominated by American and European institutions, is the arena where this silent war is waged. SWIFT, the system that connects thousands of banks around the world, acts as the artery of global trade. Controlling it is controlling the planet's lifeblood. When a country is expelled from this system, its economy becomes a body without oxygen. Its companies are isolated, its transactions frozen, its reserves trapped. It is the modern equivalent of a medieval siege, but without walls or catapults. Central banks tremble at the prospect, and that is precisely the intention. The fear of exclusion is the new scourge of the global order. And like all invisible punishments, it is justified in the name of good. Because every sanction, they say, is for democracy, for peace, for human rights. But the truth is colder. Sanctions do not seek justice, but obedience. They are coded messages that tell the world, Whoever strays from the system will pay the price. And that price is total isolation. Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, Russia. All different names, but the same verdict. Account blocking, export bans, asset freezes. And behind every measure, a silent reminder: the dollar is unforgiving. No missile could cause so much damage with such poor visibility. It is a punishment that is not filmed or broadcast, but that can collapse an entire country. And the most disturbing thing is that it is done with a click. Every time a country is sanctioned, its people feel the blow first in the market. Bread, fuel, medicine, everything goes up. Everything is scarce. The ordinary citizen pays for decisions they never made. And as their lives become more expensive, the powers announce that the punishment is for their own good. The narrative repeats itself. Sanctions are tools of correction, not oppression. But hunger and hopelessness don't distinguish intentions. Every embargo is a form of war without bullets, but with equally deadly consequences. Because a child without medicine is also a victim of power. Only their story doesn't make the headlines. And their pain isn't quoted on the stock market. The most perverse thing about sanctions is their moral character. They are applied in the name of good, but their function is disciplinary. Countries learn that money has sacred rules, and breaking them is heresy. The modern gospel says that freedom is only possible if one obeys the global financial system. Credit becomes a reward, and the blockade becomes divine punishment. Thus, aligned governments enjoy the economic flow, while dissidents drown in scarcity. Control is exercised without armies, only with contracts and clauses. And each international treaty is a new form of submission written in diplomatic ink. Because modern slavery doesn't need bars, but dependence. An invisible punishment is its most effective guarantor. In this scenario, the dollar and the global financial system are transformed into judges and executioners. A country can lose access to technology, credit, or markets overnight. All it takes is an executive order, a Treasury resolution, an IMF statement. And the flow is cut off, as if someone turned off an invisible valve. Companies flee, investors withdraw their money, banks stop lending. The economy collapses without bombs, only with silence. That is the perfection of modern punishment. No one seems responsible. Sanctioning governments plead morality, banks plead compliance, corporations plead fear. And meanwhile, the victims have no one to blame. Because the executioner hides behind a web of signatures and seals. The 21st century brought even greater sophistication. It's no longer enough to block nations. Now individuals, companies, even digital platforms are sanctioned. Sanctions are becoming personalized. They become surgical. Every account, every transfer, every asset can become a target. And the fear of being blocked generates economic self-censorship. Banks prefer not to operate with certain regions as a precaution. Global trade becomes a minefield of invisible restrictions. And trust, that fragile commodity, becomes a weapon. Because absolute control is not achieved by punishing everyone, but by making everyone fear being punished. Fear becomes the most stable currency in the system. Meanwhile, countries that have suffered these sanctions begin to build parallel routes. Russia and China create alternative systems to SWIFT. Iran trades in local currencies or in energy barters. The BRICS discusses the creation of a common currency, based not on faith, but on resources. But the foundations of the financial order are deep, and breaking them is like defying gravity. Every attempt at monetary independence is met with sabotage, pressure, or war. The invisible punishment not only seeks to break economies, but to prevent others from daring to try. Thus, control is perpetuated through imitation and fear, and the dollar remains the obligatory language of power. Not because it's fairer, but because no one has yet invented a freer language. But even invisible empires have an expiration date. The digitalization of money, cryptocurrencies, and central bank digital currencies are rewriting the rules of the game. Financial power is fragmenting, decentralizing, and multiplying. And what was once punishment from a single center may now become a game of multiple thrones. The challenge will not be escaping control, but recognizing its new forms. Because invisible punishment may mutate, but it doesn't disappear. It only changes its face. From sanctions to algorithms, from financial blockades to digital censorship. The new order won't need banks to punish. It will suffice to disconnect. And that will be the quietest sanction of all. The listener, once again, should not look for heroes or villains. Because invisible punishment does not belong only to the powerful. It is present in every act of automatic obedience, in every fear of losing access, in every comfortable silence. The global financial system is only the magnified mirror of our collective psychology. Just as nations fear being sanctioned, individuals fear being excluded. And as long as that fear governs, power needs no chains. It only needs our complicity. Because every invisible punishment begins with a voluntary acceptance. The faith that sustains money is the same faith that sustains fear. And only when we understand that, true freedom will begin. Chapter 6. Dollar Decline, China, BRICS, and the Silent Rebellion. In recent years, a murmur has begun to circulate in the halls of global economic power. It is not a revolution with flags or armies, but ascendant rebellion which is fought in the vaults of central banks. Countries tired of depending on the dollar are seeking to escape its shadow. And in that search, yuan, gold, and digital currencies are beginning to occupy the space that once seemed untouchable. The word de-dollarization is no longer a marginal concept, but a political strategy. Every contract in yuan, every payment in rubles, every exchange in rupees is a tiny crack in the walls of the green prison. And while the dollar remains the master of global trade, its throne no longer feels as solid. Because history has shown that no empire lasts forever. Only the symbols, colors, and names of the jailers have changed. But the logic of power remains unchanged. China is the epicenter of this transformation. With a gravity-defying economy and a disciplined state apparatus, it has understood that true power lies not in weapons, but in credit. Its strategy does not seek to destroy the dollar, but to slowly replace it, infiltrate it, and dilute its supremacy without direct confrontation. Bilateral agreements with Russia, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and more than 30 other countries reveal a new economic map that dispenses with the greenback. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the yuan is beginning to circulate in energy and financial contracts. While the West talks about sanctions, China talks about roads. The Belt and Road Initiative is not just infrastructure, it is a monetary network, a promise of autonomy. And every kilometer of track, every port, and every loan tied to the yuan are nails in the coffin of dollar hegemony. The rebellion, for now, is not heard in speeches, but it resonates loudly in international reserves. the Princicor, BRICS Mo bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa has become the laboratory for this transition. Its leaders no longer hide their desire to build an alternative financial system. They have discussed the creation of a common currency backed by gold, raw materials, or even energy. The idea seems bold, but it gains more supporters every year. Russia sells its gas to China in yuan, Brazil trades with India in reais and rupees, and Saudi Arabia is considering accepting non-dollar payments for its oil. It is a silent, but profound reconfiguration. The IMF and the World Bank watch cautiously as the financial map becomes multipolar. Each alliance outside the dollar system weakens the invisible network that previously bound everyone. And although the process is slow, it no longer seems reversible. Hegemony, like any prison, is beginning to show cracks from within. However, the power of the dollar lies not only in its use, but in its global trust. Since 1944, the entire world has measured its value in relation to the US dollar. Reserves, loans, trade, debt, everything revolves around its stability. That collective faith does not easily disappear. Even though countries diversify their reserves, investors still rush to the dollar in times of crisis. It is a conditioned reflex, an instinct that mixes security and dependence. So the question is not whether the dollar will fall, but when and why. Because when a currency stops representing stability and starts symbolizing domination, its fall becomes inevitable. The problem is not the weakness of the rival, but the overconfidence of the empire. And the dollar, like every empire, has begun to confuse obedience with respect. Meanwhile, gold is making a silent comeback. The world's central banks have once again stockpiled bullion, a sign of distrust toward paper money. China and Russia in particular have bought record amounts in recent years. The metal that once symbolized the prison of the gold standard is now re-emerging as a symbol of independence. Gold isn't printed, frozen, or sanctioned. It represents the physical limit to digital excess. It is the silent reminder that wealth, to be real, needs to be anchored to something tangible. In a world of electronic promises, the shine of gold makes sense again. And that shine, however discreet, reflects an uncomfortable truth. The system is beginning to mistrust itself. Faith is eroding, and with it, the basis of the monetary prison. But the most disruptive challenge comes not from the metal, but from the code. Cryptocurrencies and sovereign digital currencies are redesigning the very concept of money. The digital yuan, launched by China, seeks not only efficiency, but control. Every transaction leaves a trace, every movement can be monitored. It is a tool of surveillance, but also a form of independence from the SWIFT system and the dollar. Other countries are watching the experiment closely. If the digital yuan prospers, it could become the first currency capable of competing globally without going through American banks. It would be the new face of hegemony, more efficient, but just as controlling. Because even when the jailer changes, the prison can remain intact. Only the guard's uniform changes. On this geopolitical chessboard, de-dollarization is not just an economic issue, but a spiritual one. The world is seeking to free itself from the domination of a symbol that no longer represents balance. Emerging nations do not want to destroy the system, but to rewrite the rules. Economic multipolarity is the new gospel. But every attempt at emancipation brings with it a new kind of dependency. Today's fear of the dollar may be replaced tomorrow by fear of the yuan or the algorithm. Absolute monetary freedom remains an illusion, because money, in any form, always represents power. And power, like gravity, never disappears. It only changes direction. And it drags with it those who believed they could float out of its orbit. The dollar, however, has not yet fallen. Its roots are deep, its political and military influence still decisive. The United States maintains strategic alliances, controls information routes, dominates global financial institutions. As long as its army patrols the seas and its sanctions inspire fear, the dollar will continue to breathe. But time erodes even the firmest pillars. And each economic cycle, each crisis, each unpaid debt adds a grain of doubt. The question is no longer whether the dollar will survive, but in what form? Because even if it disappears as paper, its spirit, that of control through money, can be reincarnated in new technologies. Perhaps the dollar will die, but the prison will remain. Only its bars will be invisible and digital. Thus ends this cycle, where silent rebellion mingles with collective resignation. China builds its grid. Russia strengthens its gold. The BRICS promises autonomy. But the world continues to measure its wealth in the same unit, power. And as long as power remains concentrated, no currency will be truly free. The listener must understand that the end of the dollar does not guarantee the freedom of the world. It only paves the way for another empire, with new rules, new symbols, and the same fears. Because the history of money is not about bills or medals. It is about faith, control, and desire. And those three elements together have sustained the world ever since we learned to call value what is really just a shared illusion. The cycle continues. Final reflection: the price of faith in money. Throughout this journey, we've been following the story of a promise. The promise that money could give us security, power, and meaning. The listener has witnessed a century of financial illusion, a global theater where the actors change, but the script remains the same. The modern economy is not just a network of transactions, but a network of beliefs. Every coin, every number, every printed bill represents something deeper than value. It represents faith. Faith in governments, faith in banks, faith in the stability of a system that promised order in exchange for obedience. But like all blind faith, its price is the sacrifice of freedom. Because the more we believe in the security of money, the further we move away from inner security. And when faith becomes dependence, it ceases to be a choice. Then we understand that we do not own money, but that it owns us. This is the oldest prison in the world. The 20th century taught us to worship numbers and distrust silences. We became accustomed to measuring everything: life, time, happiness, success, even faith. Everything should have a price, every effort a tangible reward. But in doing so, we forgot that the most valuable things, calmness, love, truth, cannot be quoted on any market. Money became our global religion. Without temples, without visible gods, but with millions of faithful obeying their daily rituals. Work, consume, save, go into debt, fear. The financial calendar replaced the spiritual one. And so, with apparent freedom, we lock ourselves into a system where faith is not directed toward heaven, but toward the bank. The true miracle of the dollar was not its economic value, but its ability to make us believe that without it, there is no future. That belief was its quietest victory. Today, as the world questions the dollar's hegemony, we should ask ourselves something deeper. Are we free if everything depends on a currency? The answer lies not in markets or governments, but in the conscience of every human being. Because as long as the stability of our lives is measured by the exchange rate, we will remain slaves to an illusion. Money is a tool, but the mind turned it into identity. We were taught to say, "I have," instead of "I am." And in that simple difference lies the full weight of deception. Believing that well-being comes from accumulation and not from inner balance was the most costly mistake of our era. Modern civilization is not sustained by gold or oil, but by trust in the value of something that does not physically exist. And when that trust fades, the entire financial edifice will turn to digital dust. Only then will we remember that true wealth was never in the pocket, but in the mind. And that freedom begins when we stop obeying the invisible. At its core, money has always been a mirror. It reflects our hopes, our fears, our aspirations. But it also reflects our spiritual fragility. Because whoever needs to possess to feel fulfilled will never stop fearing losing. And that fear is the root of all manipulation. The monetary system feeds on our collective insecurity, on that feeling of scarcity that keeps us obedient. Every advertisement, every debt, every interest rate is a reminder that it is never enough. And so the wheel keeps turning, not because it is inevitable, but because we believe it is. The strongest power needs no chains. It only needs belief. Perhaps the true financial awakening lies not in destroying the system, but in seeing it for what it is. When we understand that money only has the value we give it, we regain a part of our freedom. It's not about rejecting it, but about putting it in its rightful place, as a tool, not as a master. Those who use money consciously don't fear losing it, because they understand that true value cannot be measured in numbers, but in serenity. In that understanding lies the most peaceful and profound revolution possible. An internal, invisible revolution, without banners or speeches. Only the silence of those who have stopped blindly believing. Money loses its power when it no longer governs our emotions. And that moment marks the beginning of a new form of wealth. The listener, after so many chapters, is no longer a spectator. He is part of the story, a soul that has walked the corridors of the economy and felt its weight on his spirit. Perhaps he has understood that every dollar in circulation represents hours of life exchanged for promises. Hours that never return. Moments offered in exchange for stability that rarely comes. And in that recognition, a luminous truth emerges. Life cannot be mortgaged. Time, not money, is true capital. Whoever manages their attention, manages their destiny. And whoever surrenders their mind to the obsession with external value, loses control of internal value. That's why freedom doesn't begin in the bank account, but in the conscience. That's the only currency that cannot be devalued. The future of money is uncertain, but the future of conscience shouldn't be. Each generation chooses what it wants to believe in. Some will continue to trust the dollar, others gold, others the algorithm. But those who trust in themselves will have escaped the most powerful system of all. Because no crisis can steal the calm of those who understand that abundance cannot be printed. It is cultivated, like wisdom or peace. And that inner abundance isn't listed on Wall Street, but it can sustain you when everything else collapses. That will be the true gold of the future. Not the kind that glitters, but the kind that illuminates. The kind that is not kept in vaults, but in the soul. Perhaps money was not the problem, but our relationship with it. We approach it with desire, with fear, with greed or guilt, but rarely with balance. Learning to look at money with detachment is the most complex spiritual challenge of the 21st century. Because it means deactivating centuries of conditioning. It means remembering that value is not imposed. It is created, shared, lived. And that the most real abundance is that which does not need to be demonstrated. As long as we believe in money more than in ourselves, we will remain trapped in a prison without walls. But when the heart regains its role in the economy of life, history will change. Not because the system falls, but because it will no longer have power over us. That will be the true end of the dollar. So, as the sound fades and silence envelops this final reflection, remember this. The strongest power needs no chains. It only needs belief. But you can choose what to believe in. You can choose to let go of the fear of the future and rest in the serenity of the present. Because no economic system can dominate those who live conscious of their worth. That is the final lesson, the last secret that money can't buy. Faith can build empires, but it can also free you from them. The price of faith in money was our freedom. And the act of regaining it is the beginning of a new awakening.